a lot of what we see in the world of politics and government especially is a kind of ritual dance in which all the dancers know it's a ritual dance, but they don't want to come out and say that. It's bad form to speak the truth when you're involved in politics and government activities. People want to pretend that certain things are being done, for example, for public-spirited reasons, when everybody and his dog knows that what's driving the process is powerful special interests, wealthy people involved in politics, their friends in the Congress or the regulatory agencies. Very often what we're seeing is an elaborate system of theft and misrepresentation, all covered up with ceremony and ritual that makes it seem as if it's all on the up and up. And that's the kind of overarching attitude that you find infusing the essays in this new work. I'm too old to pretend anymore. I don't have time for another 20 or 30 years of pretense. And so I have less patience with playing that game. Now, if you're in certain areas, you have to play it, because if you don't play it, you're cast into outer darkness. You just have no alternative to waltzing through the ritual dance as if people mean what they say. But we all know they don't. Where else but in politics is blurting out the truth considered a gaffe? And it is. We all see it from time to time. Somebody leaves the microphone on when he thinks it's off, and he blurts out the truth, and that becomes a scandal. Do we want to live in a world where the truth is scandalous? Well, that's the world we live in, actually. A world of pretense and make-believe. Now, of course, this isn't the case by accident. It serves various purposes. And it serves the purposes especially of incumbents, of the rich, the established, the connected, the people with political influence and clout. They like this kind of world of fake because they know what's going on and they know how to work the system. And the fakery is for the general public. It's for the people who don't have active, immediate involvement in what's going on in government and politics, and who have to be kept from becoming too restive. If people knew the truth, they'd have their pitchforks out and be coming into this city to set fires, probably. But they don't, and they're not going to find out either, because the world of politics, where politics matters, is all played between the 45-yard lines. Nobody wants to get outside the bounds of what is good form. No one wants to speak the plain truth. Everybody wants to hem and haw and cover up one's announcements and statements about how the system works. Well, I've been studying this system for more than 50 years in one way or another, and I think I know a little bit about it. And that's the kind of knowledge, if indeed I'm right about its being knowledge, that you'll find inside the covers of this book, Taking a Stand. Now, the book is divided into several big classes, and I'll just give you a general architecture in a few minutes here. I think we'll have more fun with questions and answers, but the book starts off with a number of essays about the state and politics, and the themes that run through these essays, which have to do with all sorts of things, public demonstrations, the nature of democracy, and so forth. Many of them boil down to analyses or considerations of the seen versus the unseen, of ritual versus reality, and basically of fraud versus honesty. These are all different angles by which we can look at the fact that things are not what they seem to be or not what they're represented to be. There's a clash again and again and again. A large part of the book then has to do with the analysis itself. How should we go about studying or learning about economics and the state? And my views on how economics ought to be done are not typical of economists in the mainstream of the profession. I've been a member of the mainstream profession. I was when I started out for some time, and I played their game with some success. But even at the very beginning, I was not happy with how economists went about their work in some respects, and so I was a bit of a maverick. And over time, I've become more of a maverick. I gravitated away from mainstream neoclassical economics and toward Austrian economics, but in some ways I also simply gravitated toward the kind of analysis that can be traced back to some of the Chicagoans down through the 20th century, and particularly to the offshoot of that school of economics as seen in the work of Armin Alchian and others at UCLA in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And when I was a professor at the University of Washington, we had an economics department at the time that was a preeminent department in the development of the analysis of property rights and transaction costs. And I still very much believe in that kind of neo-institutional analysis, and I've continued to do that from time to time throughout my career. One of the things that is important in doing economic analysis right is disaggregation, particularly when we look at the whole economy. Economists, for actually throughout my lifetime now, have been using a very aggregated form of analysis, which we can trace back to Keynes and the early Keynesians who wanted to represent the whole economy in very big chunks. And macroeconomics has continued to be done that way, although it's evolved through many iterations of revision and has gone to new non-Keynesian or even anti-Keynesian forms. It's continued to remain a very aggregative type of analysis. And as a result, I think it's often very misleading, indeed utterly wrong in many cases, totally misses the point. Economics is a way of thinking about choice, a way of talking about how changes in relative costs and relative benefits lead people to alter their decisions. And you have none of that in what is called macroeconomics. It's all very mechanical. In the early days, there was even a representation of the economy known as the hydraulic model, which consisted of a lot of tubes and colored water flowing around. It was a totally engineering conception of how the economy works. That's wrong. The economy is not a machine. It's not it's not an engineering contraption. It's an incredibly complex, ever-changing form of human interaction, cooperation, and competition. And you can't understand how it works if you think it's a mechanical thing. And if it has a problem, you can't fix it with some kind of mechanical solution. Indeed, if you go about it that way, you're almost certain to make matters worse rather than better. I also spend some time distinguishing between genuine explanations and what I would think often verge on ideological apologetics. The so-called new welfare economics, which has been heavily focused on the identification of so-called market failures, classification of market failures, the recommendation of government policy to remedy these market failures. this has been actually a negative development in economics, in my judgment. It's done much more harm than good. It's diverted a lot of smart people from using their brains productively. And it's led to an economics profession which actually believes that by going and doing some equations on the blackboard, they've discovered something about how the world works that's sufficient to justify the use of government policy to change the world, which is to say, sufficient to justify the intrusion of people with guns or threats of using guns into the lives of human beings with the purported goal of improving efficiency or the public's well-being in some way. I think we ought to be much more careful before we send out people with guns to do anything. And we certainly ought to be very, very careful about making economic policy and having the government enforce these rules on people on the basis of blackboard demonstrations of market failure. I speak quite a bit about an idea I've developed over the years called regime uncertainty. And this is an idea that has a long heritage. It goes back to many people's discussions of business confidence and how business confidence enters into the decision-making of people, especially during crises, financial debacles, other periods in which the economy enters into kind of uncertainty or turmoil. But regime uncertainty, as I've developed the idea, has to do with people's confidence in the security of their private property rights. It's not about what kind of monetary policy the Fed is going to carry out or anything like that, because the name regime uncertainty has been used by other economists in other senses. But in my sense, it's about the security people feel as they make their plans about the future with regard to, will they be able to control their own property? Will someone intrude on their decision-making or override their decisions? Will the fruits of their investments be taken away from them by taxes or regulation? Things of that sort. And I first developed this idea in relation to studying the long duration of the Great Depression, because it became quite obvious to me through the years of studying that particular episode that from 1935 on, really until the end of the decade, the Roosevelt administration had created tremendous fear in the minds of private investors. Many people actually believed that the government was making itself dictatorial, and Roosevelt in particular was attempting to mimic the dictatorship of Mussolini or Adolf Hitler. Now, we may in retrospect look back and say that was all hyperbole. These people had lost their grip. But if we did that, we'd be wrong. I don't think they had lost their grip. If you put yourself in their situation and consider what they knew, what they saw, how the government was dealing with them, what the President of the United States and his closest advisors were saying and doing, they had very good reason to fear that the private property order of the United States was on the verge of utter destruction. And so they acted accordingly, which is to say that long-term private investment never came close to reviving during the 1930s. And that was a major reason, if not the major reason, why the Depression persisted on and on and on, well past the end of the decade of the 1930s. But regime uncertainty shows up in other places and at other times. And what I've argued recently and what I discuss in a number of the essays in this book is how it has reappeared since 2007. The financial catastrophes of late 2008 in particular triggered a tremendous amount of panic in many circles and led the government to intervene in a whole variety of ways that had never intervened before. That I don't think any economist ever expected the Fed to do what it did from 2008 onward. I mean, the magnitude of the actions the Fed took in 2008 and 2009, and to some extent since then as well, the fact that it's held short-term interest rates in a negative real range for now 7 years, and has thereby brought about a massive misallocation and malinvestment of resources during that period, not to mention impoverishing a whole class of people who expected to live on interest earnings in their retirement. No one expected that. This was extraordinary. No one ever expected the government to nationalize almost the entire lending for residential mortgages. Fannie and Freddie were, pretending to be private institutions up to 2008. And there were, some people understood that wasn't quite the case, but nonetheless, they were paying private investors income. But of course, now they're totally state-run operations, and of course, the government nationalized to some extent. Hundreds of banks took over a couple of big automobile companies, and took countless other actions that were simply extraordinary. Now, what happened as a result of all this, along with the election of a new president who pushed for Obamacare and people in the Congress pushing to create a massive reorganization of financial regulation and other things, all this going on at once, created a resurgence of regime uncertainty. And as a result, private net business investment has remained below its pre-crisis levels virtually ever since. I mean, I haven't looked at the data recently, but if there's been a full recovery, it's only in the past year or so that it's happened. Now, private business net investment happens to be the preeminent driver of economic growth. If you create conditions in which that kind of investment is suppressed, you guarantee you're going to have an anemic economy. And that's exactly what we've had ever since that recession broke. So regime uncertainty is a theme that I've come back to quite a lot, and some of the more substantive essays in this book have to do with it. I have other things to say about economic analysis. I won't talk about those right now because they're of interest probably more to economists and serious students of economics than they are to people in general. But I do have a lot of essays in the book about the current recession, about the policies that were undertaken in response to it, a lot about the monetary policy making, and also about the fact that labor markets underwent some extraordinary changes, particularly an abrupt reduction in the ratio of employment to population, which the ratio that fell by about 5 percentage points abruptly in about a year's time in 2008, and has remained depressed ever since. What we have here in the United States is 5 or 6 million people who, as it were, disappeared from economic life so far as being producers is concerned. And nobody's quite sure what they're doing. Where'd they go? How are they surviving? Who are these people, and what are they up to now? This is not a trivial thing. We're a big economy, it's true, but when you have 5 or 6 million producers just evaporate, that's a serious matter so far as producing goods and services is concerned. So I do discuss that and put it in historical perspective in the book. If you thumb through the book, you'll find that it has a lot of graphs in it, even though it's not, as I said, a scholarly book. I did want to give some evidence when I discussed some of these topics that I wasn't just blowing hot air. The final substantive section of the book is about libertarianism. I've been a libertarian of some kind almost my entire adult life, But the kind of libertarian I am has changed over the years. I've become a crazier and crazier libertarian, I guess some would say. But nonetheless, I've still been invited back to Cato, so I can't be too nutty. But anyhow, read those essays and judge for yourself. I in particular, am a little different from many libertarians in that I don't like to fight my fellow libertarians. I don't like to engage in doctrinal infighting. There's just one case, and I do discuss it in the book. There's one case in which I do draw the line, and that is the issue of war and peace, because I think that is utterly fundamental to everything that libertarianism is and depends on. If we hand the war-making key to the state, we might as well just report for incarceration. Because once the state goes to war, it will override every other consideration in the service of its war-making. It's done this again and again. In fact, if you read my earlier book, Crisis and Leviathan, and some of my other work, you'll see a tremendous amount of evidence that World War I and World War II were the big events, not the Depression, not the New Deal. That was a kind of follow-on or sequel of World War I. The two world wars were the occasions when liberty was slaughtered in this country. And not only do people not understand that, not only do they not understand by and large how critical war-making is in the preservation of liberty or the destruction of liberty, but there's actually this kind of conservative myth that goes around about how the government's wars have been the glorious occasions when governments saved our liberty, which is total hogwash. It's utterly ahistorical. There's not a shred of substance in that claim. Before both of those world wars, Americans were freer than they were after them. And it wasn't just a coincidence. It was because of how those wars were fought and because of their legacies. So that theme, which has run through my work for decades, is still there. It's still there, particularly in my understanding of what libertarian doctrine ought to be. And the final part of the book is really a set of homages, or in some cases almost obituaries. But I only wrote these about people I knew personally. Some of them, my parents are there, some of my important teachers, colleagues, comrades, friends, all people who were important to me in my career. And those are very personal, and you may want to skip those. But these people I knew or worked with or revered in some cases as well were wonderful people. And just as no man is an island, no scholar is either. And if you want to see a beautiful illustration of that in operation right now, get acquainted with George Mason University, where there's a tremendous amount of cooperation, of joint work, of professors and teachers interacting together productively. A very different situation from what you'd find in a typical university, where there's a good deal of distance between the professors and the students, and it's only the fortunate few students who find a mentor or who are able to interact productively with their teachers. I was fortunate. I had many people who helped me along the way, and I'm grateful.